Now that we've seen how energy has to enter and leave a system, we'll look at some of the chemical cycles. Chemicals do not enter or leave the planet. All of the nutrients that we use were already here when life began. So they go through transformations, but they don't ever leave. Biogeochemical cycles are the cycles in which nutrients go through living and non-living components. Let's break that word down. The prefix bio means life, so those are the living components. The prefix geo means earth, so those would be the non-living components. And then chemical is referring to whichever nutrient is being recycled. Chemicals that are not currently a part of a living organism are inside of an abiotic reservoir. The most common abiotic reservoirs are the soil and the atmosphere. The image on the right shows a generic chemical cycle. Nutrients are stored in the soil, the abiotic reservoir. Producers, plants, then just use those nutrients to help build their bodies. Consumers eat the producers and use the nutrients to build their bodies. Both consumers and producers release some of these nutrients to the atmosphere. When the consumers and the producers die, the nutrients are returned to the soil by animals such as decomposers. This is the great circle of life. So let's look at the carbon cycle. Carbon is stored in the abiotic reservoir of the atmosphere as CO2, or carbon dioxide. Plants use the carbon dioxide in the air and turn it into sugars through a process called photosynthesis. Those sugars, which are now part of the plant's body, get eaten by the consumers. As consumers use that energy to fuel their own bodies, they release carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere by exhaling in a process called cellular respiration. When the consumers and the producers ultimately die, their bodies are broken down by decomposers. Those decomposers use the carbon that was making up their bodies and return it to the soil, into the soil reservoir. Some examples of carbon in soil reservoirs are peat moss or oil. Humans have added an additional step to the carbon cycle by removing carbon from soil reservoirs and turning them back into atmospheric carbon. We burn fossil fuels and we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We are burning the fossil fuels that were in the soil, and now they are being stored in the atmosphere. This has actually increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere faster than we can return it to the soil. Another geochemical cycle is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is really important for building DNA. Inorganic phosphates are found in rocks. Rocks are weathered by being exposed to sun and rain and the weather on the planet. The weathering of rocks helps make them into soil, which turns the phosphates into an available resource in the abiotic reservoir of the soil. The phosphates stored in the soil are available to plants. Plants absorb them through their roots and then use them to build up their own bodies, specifically DNA and ATP. Consumers can then eat the plants, so they are taking the phosphate in the plants and using it for their own bodies. When the plants and animals die, they are broken down by decomposers, and the phosphates are returned to the soil. The phosphates in the soil can then either be taken up by plants again, or they may end up in a solution in the water. Phosphates in a solution of water will settle to the bottom and form a solid on the bottom of the body of water. Eventually, the solid at the base of the water will harden into rock. Finally, geological processes such as uplifting and tectonic activity can cause those rocks to be exposed to the climate again. When they are exposed to the climate again, they are weathered. When the rocks are weathered, they are broken back down into soil, and the phosphates are available to the plants all over again. The last biochemical cycle we'll look at is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is extremely common in the atmosphere. It makes up about 80% of the air you breathe in. Unfortunately, you can't use the nitrogen in its atmospheric form of N2. The two nitrogens are triple bonded to each other, and our bodies can't break it apart. So plants and animals need different types of nitrogen. Nitrogen fixation is a process that bacteria can perform that turns nitrogen into a usable form, like ammonium or nitrate. Some plants, like legumes, which are beans and peas, have bacteria that live in their roots. They have a mutualistic relationship with these bacteria. The bacteria can turn atmospheric nitrogen, N2, into usable forms of nitrogen in a process called nitrogen fixing. There are other bacteria called free-living bacteria that live in the soil. They can turn atmospheric nitrogen into usable nitrogen in the soil. They don't have to be in the roots of plants. So nitrogen fixation turns atmospheric N2 into ammonia, which picks up another hydrogen and is stored in the soil as ammonium. Plants can use ammonium from the soil to build their bodies. Some of the ammonium in the soil gets exposed to another type of bacteria called nitrifying bacteria. These nitrifying bacteria turn ammonium into nitrates, NO3-. Plants can also use nitrates. They can use these nitrates and absorb them to build their bodies. Animals then eat the producers and use the nitrogen they get from the producers to build their bodies. Eventually, the animals and plants will die. And when they do, decomposers break down their bodies and take the nitrogen and return it back to the soil, usually in the form of ammonium. Some of the nitrates in the soil are returned to the atmosphere. Nitrates in the soil can be exposed to denitrifying bacteria. Denitrifying bacteria will turn nitrates, NO3-, back into atmospheric oxygen, N2. So it takes it from a usable form from the soil reservoir and returns it back to the atmospheric reservoir. Humans have a habit of moving nitrogen or nutrients from one part of the cycle to another. This can disrupt the natural nutrient cycling and cause problems to the environment. Eutrophication occurs when there are too many nutrients in a standing body of water like a lake or a pond. This is usually because of runoff from agriculture, which is full of fertilizers. The fertilizers fill the lake or pond with nutrients, and the excess of nutrients allows algae to grow rapidly, causing an algae bloom. The algae are green and sit on the surface of the water like a mat. The algae do photosynthesis very quickly, and so they use up large amounts of oxygen. So they deplete the oxygen available for other plants and animals in the lake or pond. This can cause other arthropods and fish to die. The algae also float at the top and form a large thick mat that blocks out the sunlight to the bottom of the lake or pond. So this could mean that grasses or other algae in the bottom of the lake can't get the sunlight they need to live. Interference in the carbon cycle has increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is influencing the global temperature, but it also results in cities like this one that are filled with thick, dense smog.